The text came in at 11:47 p.m. I was sitting in my office on the 9th floor of the Winecoop building in downtown Denver, the city lights scattered out past the window like something spilled and not cleaned up, and my phone buzzed once against the desk. Lavaiza, the house is mine now. Move your things out by Friday. I looked at it for a long moment. Not because I was shocked. Because I was doing the math. I typed 2 words back. Enjoy it. I set the phone face down on the desk, next to a set of closing documents I'd signed 4 hours earlier, and I went back to reading a term sheet like nothing in my life had just changed. By 6 a.m. the next morning, my phone showed 91 missed calls. 43 from Lavaiza. 31 from a number I didn't have saved that I already knew belonged to Derek Voss. The rest from a Denver number I didn't recognize at all, which turned out to belong to a locksmith who'd been standing on my own front porch since sunrise, confused about why the code he'd been given didn't work anymore. I didn't answer any of them. Not because I was angry, though I was. Not because I wanted to make her suffer, though if I'm honest, some part of me did. I didn't answer because there was nothing left to say that a phone call could fix. The house had stopped being hers to claim the moment she decided to take it. She just didn't know that yet. Before I tell you how that text ended, let me tell you how it started. My name is Marcus Calloway. I'm 42 years old. I run Calloway Development Group out of Denver, Colorado, and for the last 16 years I've built the kind of career most people only see the surface of, glass and steel going up where there used to be gravel lots, mixed-use buildings in Rhino and the Ballpark District, a portfolio that crossed $200 million in value last year. I didn't inherit any of it. My father spent 31 years as a general contractor in Pueblo, and I grew up on job sites before I ever set foot in a boardroom. I learned 2 things from him before I learned anything else. A building is only as good as what nobody sees. And you never, ever build on a foundation you haven't personally inspected. I met Lavaiza Ramon 6 years ago at a fundraising gala for the Denver Art Museum. She was 28. I was 36. She worked as an event planner for a boutique firm that did weddings and corporate galas for half the money people in this city, and she had this way of moving through a room like she already knew everyone was going to remember her afterward. She was sharp. She noticed details other people missed, the exact shade of a tablecloth, the timing of a toast, the way a room's energy would shift when the lighting changed. I told her that night that she'd make a hell of a developer, and she laughed and said she'd rather design the party than the building. I liked that about her. I liked a lot about her. We dated for a year and a half. I proposed at Red Rocks during a private sunset booking I'd arranged through a client. We got married at a vineyard outside Boulder, 140 guests. My sister gave a toast that made my father cry, which nobody in our family had ever seen happen before or since. It was, by every visible measure, a good life. I built it the way I build everything, carefully, deliberately, with attention to the parts that don't show. 8 years ago, before I ever met Lavaiza, I bought a house on Elm Street in the Low-High neighborhood. A 1920s brick 2-story with good bones and a bad kitchen, the kind of property I buy on instinct because I can already see what it wants to become. I didn't buy it personally. I bought it through an entity I'd set up years earlier called Winecoop Holdings LLC, because that's how I structure every piece of real estate I own, for tax purposes, for liability protection, for the simple reason that mixing personal ownership and development assets is how developers lose everything in a lawsuit. My father taught me that too. Keep your name off anything you can't afford to lose in a single bad afternoon. When Lavaiza and I got married, we moved into the Elm Street house together. It became our home in every sense that matters, her furniture, her garden beds along the side yard, for Christmases, a dog we buried under the maple tree in the back. But it never stopped being an asset of Winecoop Holdings LLC. The deed never changed. Her name was never added to the title. 3 years ago, when we refinanced to pull equity for a renovation, she signed a stack of mortgage documents at the closing table, documents that put her name on the loan, on the liability, on the monthly payment obligation. Nobody at that closing table, including her, ever handed her a deed with her name on it. Because that document didn't exist. It never had. I want to be clear about something before I keep going, because I know how this sounds from the outside. I wasn't hiding an escape hatch. I wasn't planning for a day like the one that came. For 6 years I thought about Lavaiza and Elm Street the way I think about every good investment I've ever made, as something I intended to hold on to for the rest of my life. The structure existed because that's simply how I build things. I didn't know I'd ever need it. I just never take down scaffolding I might need again. The renovation I mentioned, that's where Derek Voss enters the story. We hired Derek 18 months ago to redesign the kitchen and the primary suite upstairs. I'd actually met him through my own business 2 years before that, at a project walkthrough for a mixed-use building in the Highlands. He was 34 then, a residential architect with a small but well-regarded firm, sharp with materials, good with clients, hungry in the way I recognize because I used to be that hungry myself. I liked his work enough that I brought him 3 referrals that year alone, a duplex renovation for a colleague, a remodel for my sister's house in Golden, and finally, our own kitchen. I introduced him to half my network. I told people he was the best young architect in Denver nobody had heard of yet. I was, in every meaningful sense, the reason his firm's revenue nearly doubled in 18 months. The renovation was supposed to take 4 months. It took 11. I didn't think much of it at first. Renovations run long. Permits get delayed, subcontractors flake, supply chains for custom cabinetry from Italy don't run on anyone's schedule but their own. But somewhere around month 6, I started noticing things the way you notice a hairline crack in drywall, small, easy to dismiss, until you look at it every day for long enough that you can't unsee it. Lavaiza started being at the house during site visits I wasn't invited to. She'd mention them afterward, casually, like they were nothing. Derek stopped by to check the tile order. Derek wanted my opinion on the vanity placement. I run a development company. I look at material selections and vanity placements professionally, every single week. Nobody had ever needed my wife's opinion on tile before Derek Voss started asking for it. Her phone changed rhythm. She used to leave it face up on the kitchen counter, the way you do when you're not thinking about who's watching a screen. Somewhere in month 7, it started staying face down. She started taking calls on the back patio with the door closed, even in November, even when it was 19 degrees outside and there was no reason on earth to have a phone conversation somewhere colder than the kitchen. She stopped asking about my projects. For 5 years, Lavaiza had been the person I came home to and unpacked my day with, a difficult city council hearing, a contractor dispute, a deal that fell through. She used to ask sharp questions, the kind that told me she was actually listening. And then, sometime around month 8 of an 11-month kitchen renovation, she just stopped. I'd start telling her about a permitting fight downtown and she'd nod at a spot slightly past my shoulder, like she was listening to a podcast in another room. The last thing I noticed, the thing that made me stop telling myself I was imagining all of it, was how she started looking at the house. Not at me. At the house. She'd walk through rooms we'd lived in together for 5 years and describe them like she was seeing them for the first time, like she was already imagining someone else's version of the space. Once, in month 9, I heard her on the phone through the closed patio door say the words "when it's finished, it's going to feel like a completely different house." Not our house. A different house. I stood in the hallway holding 2 cups of coffee and I understood, in the specific and total way you understand a load-bearing wall has failed, that something in my marriage had already come down. I just hadn't walked into the room to see the damage yet. There was a smaller thing too, one I almost left out of this story because it felt too minor to matter at the time. Lavaiza had always kept a shared calendar with me, going back to the earliest days of our marriage, dentist appointments, contractor walkthroughs, dinners with my sister. Sometime around month 7, entries started appearing on it in a kind of code only she seemed to understand. Low-high 2 p.m., samples. Check-in fixtures. Vague enough to look ordinary to anyone glancing at it, specific enough that I started noticing the pattern only after I'd already seen 4 or 5 of them in a row. I run a company. I know exactly what a calendar entry looks like when someone is building a paper trail to justify their own absence in advance, because I've reviewed 100 project timelines built by people trying to make delays look reasonable after the fact. I didn't confront her. Not because I was afraid of what I'd hear. Because I've spent 16 years in an industry where the person who moves first without full information loses the negotiation every single time. My father used to say that a building doesn't fail all at once, it fails one ignored crack at a time, and the people who lose everything are the ones who patched the crack instead of finding out what was underneath it. I wasn't going to patch anything. I was going to find out what was underneath it. So I watched. I paid attention to the renovation timeline the way I pay attention to a project going sideways at work, quietly, methodically, without tipping anyone off that I'd noticed the numbers didn't add up. And in month 10, I got what I needed. I was supposed to be in Scottsdale for 3 days meeting with an equity partner on a hotel conversion project. The meeting ended a day early. I didn't call ahead. I drove straight from the airport to Elm Street at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and Derek Voss's truck was parked in my driveway with no crew van behind it, no material delivery schedule that I knew of, no reason for an architect to be alone at a client's house on a day he wasn't expected. I sat in my car across the street for 6 minutes. I want to be honest about that 6 minutes, because it's the only time in this entire story where I let myself feel something before I decided what to do about it. I sat there and I felt my chest go tight and my hands go cold, and for 6 minutes I was just a man in a driveway finding out his life had a crack running through the foundation. I thought about every dinner Derek Voss had sat through at our table, every referral I'd made on his behalf with my own name attached to the recommendation, every time I'd told a colleague he was the best young architect in this city nobody had discovered yet. I thought about how many times he'd shaken my hand over the last 18 months while already knowing something I didn't. 6 minutes is a long time to sit with a realization like that. Then I got out of the car, and I let myself feel calm again, because calm was the only thing that was going to be useful to me for the rest of that day. I didn't storm in. I used my key like it was any other Tuesday. I found them in the kitchen, not the master suite, not anything I need to describe in more detail than this, standing close together over a set of cabinet samples in a way that had nothing to do with cabinets. Derek saw me first. His face did something I recognize from negotiations that have just gone very badly for the person across the table. Lavaiza turned around a half-second later, and whatever she'd been about to say died somewhere between her throat and her mouth. Marcus. My name, flat, the way you say a word you weren't ready to need yet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything, though I want to be honest that I thought about it. I looked at Derek Voss, a man whose firm's growth I'd personally underwritten with referrals worth more than his entire client roster from 2 years earlier, and I said one sentence. You should leave now, and I'd think very carefully about how you want your firm's next 12 months to look. He left. He didn't argue. Some part of him already understood exactly what he'd just put at risk, even if he didn't yet know the full size of it. I want to pause here and tell you something my father said to me once about buildings, because it's the thing I thought about more than anything else over the next several hours. He said the people who design a structure to fail rarely mean for it to happen all at once. They cut one corner, then another, then they convince themselves the corners they cut don't matter because the building's still standing. It's still standing right up until the day it isn't. I think that's what happened to my marriage. I don't think Lavaiza woke up one day and decided to destroy something. I think she cut one corner, then convinced herself it was fine, then cut another, for 11 months, until the structure she'd been quietly hollowing out finally had nothing left holding it up. Lavaiza and I talked that night. I'm not going to walk you through every minute of it, because most of it was the kind of conversation you've either had yourself or can imagine well enough without me spelling it out. She cried. She said it had been going on for around 7 months. She said she didn't plan it, that it started as something small and became something she couldn't stop, that she'd been unhappy longer than she'd admitted to either of us. She said the house didn't feel like it belonged to both of us anymore, that somewhere in the last year she'd started thinking of it as something she'd outgrown, something she wanted to remake into a life that didn't have me standing in the middle of it. I listened to all of it without interrupting. And then I told her I needed some time, and I left for a downtown hotel that night, and I started making calls the next morning. The first call was to Patricia Chin. Patricia has handled every piece of legal structuring for Callaway Development Group for the last 11 years, every LLC, every title transfer, every closing. She's not the kind of attorney who asks you how you're feeling. She's the kind who asks what you need and how fast you need it. Marcus. What's going on? I told her. Not everything, just the parts relevant to what I needed her to do. The house on Elm Street. The renovation. Derek Voss. I told her I wanted to understand exactly what my legal position was, and I wanted to understand it before the day was over. Give me 2 hours, she said. I already know most of the answer, but I want to pull the file before I tell you anything, because I'm not going to give you something you can't rely on. 2 hours later, she called back, and she told me what I already suspected but hadn't let myself fully believe until I heard it from someone whose job it is to be right about this. The Elm Street property had never left Winecoop Holdings LLC. Lavaiza's name was on the mortgage from the refinance 3 years earlier, which meant she carried liability for the loan, but liability for a debt is not the same thing as ownership of an asset, and no deed had ever been executed transferring any interest in the property to her personally. In the eyes of Colorado law, in the eyes of the county recorder's office, in the eyes of anyone who pulled the title, the house belonged entirely to an LLC that I owned, and had owned, since 8 years before I met her. She has no ownership claim on the house itself, Patricia said. In a divorce, a court could still look at things like contributions to the marital home, and that's a conversation we'd need to have if this goes to a full proceeding. But she cannot simply decide the house is hers and move someone into it. That's not how title works, Marcus, and I think on some level she knows that, or she wouldn't have needed to say it out loud in a text message instead of to a lawyer. I asked her what my options were if I wanted to move quickly. You want to sell it, she said. It wasn't a question. I want it gone before this turns into a fight I have to have in a courtroom for 2 years, I said. I want it handled the way I'd handle any asset that's become a liability. Clean, fast, documented. She was quiet for a second. You understand what that looks like from the outside? I understand exactly what it looks like, I said. I don't care. Here's what most people don't understand about how a developer thinks, and it's the thing I want you to sit with for a second, because it's the whole reason the next 48 hours went the way they did. In my world, an asset that's become emotionally compromised isn't something you fight to hold on to out of stubbornness. It's something you exit, cleanly, on your own terms, before someone else forces you into a worse deal. I've been quietly floating the idea of selling Elm Street for almost a year anyway. The low-high market had appreciated close to 60% since I bought it, and I had a standing relationship with a family office called Riverstone that had been asking me for exactly this kind of turnkey renovated property in that neighborhood for months. The kitchen and primary suite Derek Voss had spent 11 months renovating had, ironically, made the house more valuable than it had ever been. I wasn't destroying anything. I was closing a position that had already stopped making sense to hold. Patricia called Riverstone's acquisitions director that afternoon. By that evening, I had a verbal agreement on price, $1.85 million, all cash, 30-day close waivable to 5 days if both sides moved fast. I told her I wanted it done in 5 days. She told me that was aggressive but not impossible, not for a cash buyer with no financing contingency and a seller who already had every document in order because he'd structured the ownership cleanly from the very beginning. That's the part one want you to understand. Nothing about the speed of what happened next was improvised. It was fast because I had spent 8 years building the foundation for exactly this kind of clean exit, even though I never once, in 8 years, imagined I'd need it for this reason. The second call I made that day was to my father. Walter Callaway is 70 years old. He spent 31 years running his own contracting business out of Pueblo before he retired, and he built more houses with his own hands than most developers build in a career of signing checks. He taught me framing before he taught me anything about business, because he believed you couldn't understand a building until you understood what held it up when nobody was looking at it. I told him what happened. He didn't say much at first. My father has never been a man who fills silence just to fill it. Did she know what she was doing while she was doing it? He finally asked. Yes. Then it's not a mistake. A mistake is something you didn't see coming. She saw it coming for almost a year. He was quiet again for a moment. What do you want to do about the house? I want to sell it. Fast. Before this turns into something ugly. Good, he said. You don't fight somebody for a house they were already planning to burn down around you. You take the parts worth saving and you walk away before the roof comes in on both of you. That's not cold, Marcus. That's just knowing which walls are load-bearing and which ones were never holding anything up to begin with. That's the closest my father has ever come to telling me he was proud of a decision before I'd even finished making it. The third call was to my sister, Renee. She's 39, runs a marketing firm out of Golden, and she's the person in my life who's never once needed me to explain myself before she took my side. She showed up at my hotel that night with 2 coffees and a look on her face that told me our father had already called her. You don't have to talk about it, she said, setting a coffee down in front of me. I'm not here to make you talk about it. I know. We sat for a while without either of us saying much. Renee has always been comfortable in silence in a way I've come to rely on more than I probably admit. You sold the house, she finally said. Not a question. Selling it. Closing in 5 days if Riverstone moves at the pace their guy promised. She let out a low breath. And Lavaiza doesn't know yet. Not yet. You're going to let her find out the way she's going to find out. I am. Renee nodded slowly, turning her coffee cup in her hands. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Do you think she loved you? Or do you think she loved the life the house represented? I thought about that longer than I expected to. I think she loved both, for a while. I think somewhere in the last year, Derek became easier to love than the version of our life that required actual work to hold together. People don't usually leave all at once. They leave a little at a time, and then one day they've been gone so long the leaving itself barely registers as a decision. Renee didn't argue with that. She just reached over and squeezed my hand once, the way she's done since we were kids, and let the silence sit there instead of trying to fix it. You're not going to tell her before it happens, are you? She finally said. About the sale. No. Some people would say that's cruel. Letting her find out the hard way instead of giving her a heads up. Some people would say that, I agreed. But I gave her 11 months of chances to be honest with me, Renee. 18 months, if you count how long she and Derek were circling each other before anything crossed a line. I don't owe her a courtesy she never once extended to me. I'm not trying to humiliate her. I'm just done managing her feelings about a decision that was never hers to make in the first place. Renee studied me for a second, the way she used to when we were kids and she was deciding whether I actually meant something or was just saying it to sound tougher than I felt. Good, she said finally. Because I was worried you were going to try to be the bigger person about this in a way that just gets you hurt twice. I'm not interested in being the bigger person, I said. I'm interested in being the person who's still standing when it's over. If you're finding this story pulls you in the way these ones tend to, take a second to hit subscribe. We tell stories like this one every week, and it genuinely helps the channel when you do. Drop a like too if you're the kind of person who believes calm can be its own kind of power. Now back to the story. Over the next 4 days, I did exactly what I do at work when a deal is moving fast and I need everyone rowing in the same direction. I stayed quiet, I let Patricia and Riverstone's team handle the mechanics, and I moved my personal belongings out of Elm Street in 2 calm, unremarkable trips while Lavaiza was at work, my grandfather's tools, the leather chair from my home office, a box of photographs, nothing dramatic, nothing that would tip her off that anything had changed beyond the obvious fact that her husband had moved out. I didn't touch her things. I didn't touch the furniture. I left the house exactly as livable as it had been the day before, because I wasn't trying to make a point. I was closing a transaction. On day 4, the final purchase agreement was signed. Riverstone wired earnest money into escrow that afternoon. Closing was scheduled for the following morning at 9 a.m., with possession transferring to the new owners the same day. I found out later, from Renee, who heard it from a mutual friend, that Lavaiza had spent those 4 days moving forward with a plan of her own, one that had nothing to do with anything Patricia and I were doing, because Lavaiza didn't yet know any of it was happening. She'd apparently decided, in the wake of our conversation the night I found Derek in the kitchen, that the cleanest way to end things in her favor was simply to occupy the house and dare me to fight her for it. She told friends she was planning to have Derek move in that weekend. She told her sister she'd already spoken to a locksmith about changing the codes on the smart lock, the same system I'd installed 2 years earlier and still had full administrative access to. She apparently believed that possession, in her mind, functioned like a kind of unofficial ownership, that if she simply held the house long enough and loud enough, I'd back down rather than fight her over it in public. She had no idea there wasn't going to be anything left to fight over. The text came in Thursday night, the night before closing, at 11:47 p.m., the same text I opened this story with. The house is mine now. Move your things out by Friday. I already knew, by then, that the deed would be recorded to Riverstone family office by 10 a.m. the next morning. I already knew the locksmith she'd hired to change the smart lock codes was going to show up Friday morning to a house whose ownership had transferred hours earlier to a family she'd never heard of. I already knew Derek Voss's moving truck, if it existed, was going to arrive at an address that belonged, as of the following day, to somebody else entirely. So I typed 2 words. Enjoy it. And I meant it, in a way I don't think she understood until the next morning. The closing happened at 9:04 a.m. Friday. Patricia called me at 9:11 to confirm the deed had been recorded with the Denver County Clerk and Recorder. Riverstone's acquisitions director called at 9:20 to thank me for how clean the process had been, and to ask, almost as an afterthought, whether I knew anything about a woman who might show up at the property that morning under the impression she still lived there. I told him she might. I told him to have his property manager handle it the way he'd handle any unauthorized person on a property he now owned, politely, but with the police called if necessary. By 9:45, the calls started. Lavaiza first, 4 in a row, then texts I didn't read in full until later that afternoon. What did you do? Marcus, call me right now. There are people here. Who are these people? This is my house. Then Derek's number, calling for the first time, 3 times back to back. Then a Denver number I didn't know, the locksmith, it turned out, standing on a porch he could no longer get into, calling the only phone number on file from the last time he'd serviced that smart lock 2 years earlier, which happened to be mine. I let all of it go to voicemail. I ordered breakfast in my hotel room. I read the paper. By the time I finally called Patricia back around noon, she told me Riverstone's property manager had, in fact, called the Denver police non-emergency line that morning to report an individual attempting to gain unauthorized entry to a residence, and that the responding officer had explained to a visibly stunned Lavaiza Calloway that the property she was standing in front of had changed ownership at 10:04 that morning, and that she would need to leave the premises. 91 missed calls by the next morning. 43 from her. 31 from Derek. The rest from a locksmith who, as far as I know, never did get paid for that Friday morning, since the job he'd been hired for no longer existed by the time he arrived. I didn't call any of them back that day. I let Patricia field the one legal inquiry that eventually came through from an attorney Lavaiza had hired, and the answer Patricia gave was short and accurate. The property in question had never been titled in Lavaiza Calloway's name, the sale had been executed by the sole legal owner of record prior to any divorce filing, and there was no ownership interest for anyone to contest. Lavaiza came to see me 4 days later, at my request, at a coffee shop near my office instead of anywhere either of us used to consider home. She looked different than she had at Elm Street, thinner around the eyes, The kind of tired that doesn't come from one bad night but from a week of realizing something you believed about your own leverage was never true. "You sold our house," she said, before she'd even sat down. "I sold my house," I said. "The one you tried to claim in a text message instead of talking to a lawyer, because some part of you knew what a lawyer was going to tell you." She flinched at that, but she didn't argue it. 8 years, Marcus. You never told me it wasn't in both our names. You never asked. In 8 years, you never once asked whose name was on the deed of the house we lived in. I didn't hide it from you. I structured it the way I structure every property I own, the same way I did years before I ever met you. It just never mattered to either of us until you decided you needed it to matter. It's still cruel, she said quietly. Selling it out from under me like that. Letting me stand there with movers and police and no idea what was happening. I thought about that for a moment, because I wanted to give her an honest answer instead of a satisfying one. I didn't sell that house to hurt you, Lavaiza. I sold it because it stopped being a place I wanted to live the day I found Derek standing in that kitchen. Everything after that was just mechanics. You're the one who decided to occupy it and dare me to fight you publicly instead of letting the two of us handle this like adults with lawyers. I didn't create that moment. I just declined to lose it. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked down at her hands for a long moment, and when she looked back up, some of the anger had drained out of her voice. The police showing up, Marcus. Do you understand what that felt like? Standing on a porch I'd woken up in every day for 5 years, being told by a stranger in uniform that I needed to leave. I do understand it, I said. I understand it because I imagined it happening exactly that way before it ever did. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfort right now. I knew Riverstone's property manager would call it in if someone showed up claiming ownership without paperwork to back it up. I didn't stop that from happening. But I also didn't create the situation that made it happen. You did that the moment you decided a text message could function as a deed. That's a cold way to put it. It's an accurate way to put it, I said. I've spent my whole career being precise about who owns what, because I've seen what happens to people who aren't. I wasn't going to start being imprecise the one time it actually mattered to my own life. Was any of it real? The last 6 years? I think most of it was, I said. I think somewhere in the last year and a half, you started building a different version of your life without telling me, the same way I'd have noticed if a contractor started building something on my land without a permit. I think you convinced yourself that made it less real instead of more. I don't think you set out to destroy anything. I think you cut one corner, and then another, until there wasn't enough structure left to hold up what we had. She didn't argue with that either. I want to tell you about the part of this story that happened away from Lavaiza entirely, because it matters just as much, and it's the part one think people miss when they hear stories like this one and assume the only consequence that counts is the one that hits the person who was unfaithful. Derek Voss's firm depended on Callaway Development Group for close to 40% of its annual billings by the time all of this happened, a fact I hadn't fully totaled up until Patricia pulled the numbers for me during that same week. I'd referred him 3 major residential clients over 2 years, I'd personally vouched for his firm at 2 industry events, and I'd been in the early stages of bringing him in as design lead on a 12-unit townhome project in the Berkeley neighborhood, a contract worth close to $400,000 in design fees alone. I pulled all of it. Not out of spite, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in it, but for the same reason I sold Elm Street. I don't keep financially entangled with people I no longer trust to be near anything I've built. I called the Berkeley project's lead investor and told him I was restructuring the design team. The townhome contract went to a different firm within a week. I let it be known, quietly, among the 3 clients I'd referred him, that I was no longer in a position to vouch for his work going forward, without ever explaining why, because a good referral withdrawn without explanation says more in this industry than any explanation could. Derek's firm lost roughly 60% of its active project pipeline within 2 months. I heard, secondhand, that he had to lay off 2 junior architects by the end of that quarter. I felt exactly one thing about that, and it wasn't guilt. I felt the particular, quiet satisfaction of watching a structure that had never had proper support underneath it finally show its cracks in daylight, the same way it would have eventually shown them with or without my help. I just happened to be the one who stopped holding it up. The divorce itself was, by the standards of these things, almost boring. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, and Patricia was clear from the beginning that a court could still consider Lavaiza's contributions to the marital home even without a title interest, so we didn't walk away from that conversation entirely. I agreed to a settlement that reflected her years of contribution to our life together fairly, her share of retirement accounts we'd built jointly, a portion of proceeds from another property we did co-own, a settlement that any reasonable person would call generous. I wasn't interested in scorched earth. I was interested in a clean exit, the same as always. The house itself was never part of the conversation, because there was never anything to negotiate. You cannot split an asset that was never yours to begin with. 6 weeks after the sale closed, I moved into a loft in the ballpark neighborhood, 5 minutes from my office, in a building I'd developed myself 4 years earlier. 19th floor, west-facing windows toward the mountains, the kind of clean, uncomplicated space that felt less like a compromise and more like a decision. My father came up from Pueblo to see it the first weekend I moved in. He stood at the window for a long time without saying anything, the way he does when he's actually thinking instead of just being quiet. "You built a good life the first time," he finally said. "You'll build a better one now. You know why?" "Why?" "Because now you know exactly which walls were load-bearing and which ones were just drywall pretending to hold something up. Most people never get to find that out about their own life until it's too late to use it." 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from a name I didn't recognize, a managing partner at a private investment group out of Boston that specialized in commercial real estate acquisitions across secondary markets. They'd been tracking my portfolio's performance for over a year, they said, and they had a proposal, a joint venture fund focused on mixed-use redevelopment in mid-size western cities, with me running acquisitions and asset strategy. $90 million in committed capital for the first close. I took the meeting. 4 months later, Callaway Ashford Capital launched its first fund with 3 projects already under contract. The work was the same work I'd always done. I was simply doing it without the quiet, low-grade weight of a foundation I'd stopped fully trusting years before I let myself admit it. I ran into Lavaiza once, about 5 months after the divorce, at a coffee shop in the Highlands neither of us used to frequent together, which I think is exactly why we both ended up there. She looked well, put together in the specific way that takes real effort after a hard year, not the effortless kind she used to wear like a second skin. We talked for maybe 4 minutes. Careful, polite, the conversation of 2 people who used to know each other completely and now knew each other the way you know a stranger you happen to share a history with. "I heard about the new fund," she said. "Congratulations. That's not nothing." "Thank you," I said. "How's the new place?" "Small," she said, with something that might have been a real smile. "Honest, though. I like it more than I expected to." "Good," I said, and I meant it. "I never should have sent that text," she said, quieter, looking somewhere past my shoulder the way she used to look at me when she'd already stopped listening months before I noticed. I think some part of me knew it wasn't going to work the way I wanted it to. I think I just needed to feel like I had control over something, and that was the only thing I could think to grab onto. "I know," I said. And I did know. I'd thought about that specific truth more than almost anything else in the 5 months since, that the text hadn't really been about the house at all. It had been about a woman trying to prove to herself that she still had power over a life she'd already spent a year quietly walking away from. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. You too." And that was it. No anger left in either of us by then, just the particular, clean quiet of 2 people who'd finally finished a project neither of them had planned to build. My name is Marcus Callaway. I'm 42 years old. I run a real estate investment fund out of Denver, Colorado, and I built the life I have now on the same principle my father gave me before I ever understood how much I'd eventually need it. You don't fight to hold on to a structure that's already failed. You find out exactly what's load-bearing, you save what's worth saving, and you walk away clean from everything else, before the whole thing comes down on top of you while you're still standing inside it trying to prove a point. I didn't sell that house to punish Lavaiza. I sold it because the day I found Derek Voss in my kitchen, the house had already stopped being something I wanted to hold on to. The sale was simply the mechanical follow-through of a decision my gut had already made 11 months earlier, the same week the renovation started running long for reasons that had nothing to do with cabinetry. I've been asked, since all of this happened, whether I feel any guilt about how fast I moved, about the 91 missed calls, about a woman standing on a porch with a locksmith and no idea the ground underneath her had already shifted the night before. I don't. Not because I don't understand how it looked from the outside. I understand exactly how it looked. I just also understand something most people don't find out until it's far too late to use it, that the person who knows the true structure of a thing always has the advantage over the person who's only ever seen the paint on the walls. 2 words ended it. Not because 2 words are powerful on their own, but because by the time I typed them, there was nothing left for a longer sentence to accomplish. Everything that needed deciding had already been decided, quietly, over 4 days, by a man who learned a long time ago that the best move in a losing position is the one you make before anyone else realizes the position has already changed. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something, because I think about it more than I expected to. Do you think I moved too fast, closing that sale before she even had a chance to fight for the house? Or do you think some doors close the moment somebody decides to burn them down, whether they mean to or not? Drop your answer in the comments, I read every one of them. And if this story meant something to you, hit subscribe. We tell real stories here, the quiet kind, the kind where the loudest thing that happens is 2 words on a phone screen at midnight. We're just getting started.